Okay, let's begin the final session of the 2 days long conference. Thanks for coming. And first of all, I would like to thank President Ham Jae-bong for holding this very meaningful and timely conference. Before starting, let me briefly introduce the presenters. By the way, my name is Dongho Jo. I am moderator and presenter as well. I'm professor of North Korean Studies at Ewha, Women's University. And we have the other 3 presenters. First, Dr. Go Myong-hyun. He is a research fellow at the Asan Institute. His research areas are social networks, complex social interactions over space, and the geospatial modeling of disease. Disaster? Here it says disease.
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, that's right?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. And he got, he studied at Columbia University and get PhD in policy analysis from Land graduate school. And the other presenter is Bruce Bennett. You may know him very well. He is a senior defense analyst at Land Corporation. He got PhD in policy analysis from Land Institute as well. And final speaker is Scott Snyder. He is mostly Korean. And Scott is a senior fellow for Korean Studies at Council on Foreign Relations. He studies at Rice University and got master's degree in East Asian Studies at Harvard University. We have 4 presentations and we have 1.5 hours, so I think each presenter will have 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will have about half an hour for Q&A for people here. Then, would you start first?
I'd be happy to.
Okay, please.
All right. Can you get the slide? There we go. I think we should be very clear from the beginning as we think about North Korea that Kim Jong-un leads a barbaric, brutal, impoverished country. You have to start from that position to understand the conditions which could evolve and the situations that could develop. The Kim family has guided the economy into near collapse, into desperate situations. The infrastructure is severely damaged and aged. They use propaganda to deny information to their people about what's going on in the world and about their culpability for their bad behavior, and trying to divert that attention to others, especially their key enemies, South Korea and the United States. But fortunately, outside information is penetrating. Not hugely yet, but some, getting through and getting into the people, which has got to be causing great concern for the regime. And so we have to ask, as we're looking at the long term, will the regime be viable in the long term? Can it contain? And I have to say, we don't know. It's very difficult to project. Think of all of those people looking at Germany in the mid-1980s. How many predicted that Germany would come apart, East Germany would come apart in 1989, and that within a year you would have a unified Germany? I don't know anybody who did. And yet it happened. And the problem, of course, with these kinds of future projections is they depend critically upon very specific events. It seems to me that if we look at the kinds of events that could matter, on the one hand, we could have Kim Jong-un surviving for decades, 30, 40 years, maybe even his son taking over from him. On the other hand, we could see a situation where he's assassinated next week, next year, 5, 10 years from now. We don't know when. Clearly, I think we can expect there will be attempts to do that. There have been some reported already. And you don't know whether they're real reports, whether there are other cases which have been covered up. That lack of information prevents us from being able to have a full sense of what this future might hold. But if that assassination occurs, then we have a series of branches which could develop. If he's dead, maybe somebody from the Kim family will take back over. Someone will assume the role and have the leadership and continue the family. Maybe somebody from the military will. If you look at those specific alternatives, Kim Jong-un stays alive, he gets replaced by someone in his family, or the military takes over, I think the bottom line in each of those cases is the same. You continue to have a barbaric, impoverished country. It might still meddle through in the coming years. It might still be able to continue to exist. They certainly have built the infrastructure to be able to do that, and it's very hard to predict when that might fail. On the other hand, if Kim Jong-un is suddenly gone from North Korea, if he has been assassinated, if he dies, whatever the circumstance is, we have to first of all posit that there is not likely going to be a successor designated. After all, Kim Jong-un won't want to designate a successor. What a great way to set up a coup by designating a successor. Think of how his dad operated, refusing to talk about succession for many, many years, until he was so seriously in health difficulties that there wasn't much choice. If indeed that continues to be the case, then if Kim Jong-un is gone, you have a second tier of leadership. And while that second tier of leadership, Kim Jong-un might feel support him in his efforts, I think quite a number of those people are unlikely to like each other. In fact, probably most of them will feel that if one of the others takes over the leadership, their future is doomed dramatically. And so one could well get a division of that second tier into factions, groups that would contest with each other initially, trying to decide which faction should take control or which combination of factions. We don't know how such a confrontation would come out. At least one of the alternatives is that none of the factions would be able to prevail. And in that kind of case, then you probably have a situation where the factions start to divide. They take over different geographic areas, and they compete with each other. Now, in these kinds of circumstances, as the government would start to fall apart, we have to remember the experience of December 2009 and the currency revaluation. Remember that when the currency was revalued and people had to hold on to something, to hold on to wealth, many people hoarded food. And so in a circumstance where you get a failure of the government, people will flock to foreign currency, but they will probably also hold on to goods like food as a way of preserving wealth and money. If they do, food could disappear from the market. That's what happened with the currency revaluation. Between early December 2009 and early February 2010, the price of food went up 1,000%. And possibly you could see the same thing in North Korea, even worse perhaps. And at the same time as that happens, humanitarian disaster, as people can't find food, people are starving, and they've done a great job of muddling through with the poor food situation in the north. But if things get exasperated on top of them already not doing very well in food across the country, then we have to worry about the development of the circumstances. In that kind of situation, I think we can anticipate that the military, which already is not doing all that well food-wise, would go out and try to take food away from those who have it. And that behavior could cause the development of a degree, at least, of lawlessness in the country. The combination of inability to find the food you need and a breakdown in the individual security situation are the classic conditions which lead to people displacing from their homes and becoming refugees. And as a humanitarian crisis then begins to develop, it's entirely plausible to see South Korea and also China concluding that they have little choice but to intervene, especially if the factions begin fighting with each other and fall into civil war. And thus you could see a North Korea or a South Korean intervention, a Chinese intervention, maybe some areas which continue without influence from one side or the other and devolve into a degree of anarchy, and a development of hopefully a degree of unification, but a question mark of, will South Korea be able to stabilize the area of the north that it chooses to occupy? Now, this is a critical question because you have to ask, what exactly is the future of the South Korean military? Remembering that South Korea suffers from some of the most limited demographics in the world at this stage, with 1.2 births per woman per lifetime. If you project out the age group that gets brought into the military, roughly those 20 years of age, between 1975 and 2003, in all but 2 years, the number of young men turning 20 was over 400,000. By 2027, that number will be very close to 200,000. And in a country which conscripts all of the young men, or almost all of them, that don't volunteer, that means your military in South Korea is going to decline substantially in size. And even with the current military, I would argue that if this kind of collapse occurs, it's not clear to me that the current military can stabilize all of North Korea. Think about it. North Korea has 30 active duty divisions, 60 reserve divisions, according to the Defense Ministry, 200,000 special forces, and you're going to go up with 22 active duty divisions and maybe some reserves. But think of the South Korean reserve units. Your reservists train 3 days a year. What soccer team would you think much of that trained its players only 3 days a year? Not a great prescription for being able to deal with an insurgency, which is a very difficult kind of warfare to deal with. And so we could see some complications, but especially if the ROK Army declines in the way that it is currently projected, it may be impossible for South Korea to fully establish control in the north. In fact, unification could even fail. Look at what happened in Iraq in 2004 and 2005 until we surged and then turned to co-opting many of the Iraqi populations. What efforts exactly are going on now in co-opting the North Korean elites, senior military officers, and so forth? Shouldn't we be working on the same kind of thing, given the experience we had with Iraq? So the future, it seems to me, is highly uncertain. There are a number of situations which could make it very complicated and not allow us to accomplish the outcomes that I think many of us would like to see. I'm not anxious to see North Korea dominated by the Kim family for the next 3 or 4 decades. I'd like to see change. I think unification of Korea is the right thing to accomplish, but I don't think it's going to be easy or cheap. And I think we could fail if we're not better prepared than we are today. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Scott, would you speak first? Yes, because Dr. Go and I have PowerPoint presentations, so
Okay.
you speak first.
I was really looking forward to being the last speaker, and I'm sure that all of you were looking forward to me being the last speaker as well. Thank you to Asan Institute for inviting me to this conference. On the other hand, I find that I've been assigned to a panel which is essentially a variant of the question that I dislike the most as someone who actively watches Korea. The question I usually comes in the form of, when will Korea be reunified? And usually what I say is, well, I'm an analyst, not a fortune teller. So I'm really not equipped. You can go down the street and find the fortune teller and ask that question. But what I thought that I could do that would be useful is just to step back and, I think that as Bruce has indicated, a lot really depends on timing in terms of what might happen. But I do think that there are, broadly speaking, a set of factors that we can think about that is useful for imagining different pathways for what we might expect. And for me, if I really boil it down, I think that the way of looking at that revolves around three main factors. One is when we're talking about long-term futures on the Korean Peninsula, what is the means by which developments are going to occur? And specifically, is this going to be a process that is peaceful or violent? Okay? That matters a lot. Secondly, what is the end result going to be? And here it's really reunification or division, continued division. And I think the third factor is, how do the first two interact with the broader context, the environment, in terms of whether or not events on the peninsula support relative regional stability or regional instability, or whether the environment is conducive to supporting whatever happens on the peninsula. So if we just think about those three factors, and I'm sorry that I didn't do a graph or PowerPoint in order to show you what this would look like, because I think that graphically it would be easier to see. I just want to put out four possibilities for thinking based on those factors in terms of what might happen. I think one pathway that we can think about is the idea of essentially getting to peaceful coexistence but without Korean unification. And in this case, the argument would be that status quo might conform to conditions that would support a stable regional environment. A second possibility would be peaceful coexistence leading to unification in the form of a confederation or a federation. And it's an interesting question how that process might interact with the regional environment. Would it be a process that ended up being a source of stability or a source of division? I think most probably a source of stability in that particular scenario. The third, I think, possibility that we can imagine is Korean reunification by violent means, non-peaceful unification. And here I think the big concern is that it could be a source of regional division. But I think it's also interesting to think about whether there is a circumstance under which a violent process leading to Korean unification might also win regional backing or be a force for regional cooperation. And then the fourth broad scenario that I want to suggest is Korean reunification essentially under a either hegemonic auspices or a unification that is accompanied by a collective or cooperative security environment. That would be a peaceful process to reunification that would also essentially be a source of regional stability. And Bruce has already talked a lot about North Korea, but I also just wanted to put, essentially, the main dilemma, with regards to North Korea, on the table, and that is, as far as I see it, the fundamental challenge that the regime faces is changes are occurring. Does the regime have the capacity to manage change? And here we've already talked about it in the other sessions, but I really do see the dilemma that North Korea faces at this point is essentially insoluble. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, there are two types of instruments that we can imagine that the government could use in order to have the capacity to manage change. One would be coercive instruments, and the other would be adaptive instruments or reformist instruments. And I think the dilemma is that if you think about use of coercive instruments or a conservative pathway for trying to manage change, in the short term, it's likely to lead to potentially near-term stability, but there's also greater potential for friction or clashes as part of suppressing economic choices. And you're reinforcing political controls in the near term, but ultimately longer term, it's not necessarily clear that those coercive measures are going to be effective over time, or that it's going to be possible to bottle up the desire for economic freedom that is bound to continue to persist, and you're faced with a system that is basically characterized by stagnancy. On the other hand, a reformist approach to managing change risks reforms that stimulate growth, but at the cost of being able to maintain political control in the near term. And longer term, you have potential for pluralization, but you also have power diffusion within the system, greater potential for dissent, possibly against the backdrop of economic growth. But essentially, I think that those two approaches in some ways are fused together by this dual approach of trying to hold on to nuclear weapons and do economic development. And it's just not clear, at least to me, how it's going to be possible to achieve both of those objectives. Having said that, I think it's almost inevitable that the North Koreans are going to try to do both before they, as part of the pathway of trying all the alternatives, perhaps before accepting that it's not possible to do both. And the third area that I just want to dig into a little bit more is related to, longer term. If we think about, the question of North Korean instability and the regional environment, one issue that I think is important to flag is the nature of the respective approaches of China and South Korea as potential external influences. Frankly, in the context of North Korean stability, I'm not sure that any potential competition between China and South Korea is really going to matter or be terribly decisive. But in the event of instability, I think that there is a possibility that that the differences between China and South Korea would emerge as sticking points that could become important. And so, one aspect of this particular challenge or dilemma that I think is interesting is that, as long as North Korea is stable, China has more economic influence. And actually, the peak for China's influence, as we think about North Korea, it really depends on forestalling instability. It depends on preventing instability from breaking out. Whereas I would argue that for South Korea, currently economic influence is somewhat limited, but in a circumstance where instability might develop, I actually think that South Korea's influence might be considerably greater. And so this, I think, is really a kind of a sticking point or a challenge as we think about tactical approaches and the regional environment, and as we think about objectives. The the trade-off between stability and possibly or coexistence and unification. And I want to just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Why don't you go down and after the presentation we'll come back? Sure.
I'll wait until the screen comes down completely. But then, thanks for coming, everyone. And I'll be presenting about the potential refugee outflows of North Korea in case there's a regime change. And that actually segues nicely into what Bruce just presented, in a way. And you might start wondering what they teach at Rand Graduate School now that we talk about the similar topic all the time. So basic idea is that regime change in North Korea is probably only possible if there's some sort of civil war, some sort of political violence. Sure. Can you hear me now? Oh, great. So, okay, ready? So I think the central hypothesis in my research is that regime change in North Korea is probably only possible if there's some sort of civil war or some sort of like political confrontation. For example, we often talk about, like economic collapse or natural disasters or famines might lead to some sort of a regime change. But I think that's really unlikely because of what happened in the 90s, for example. During the famine in the 90s, up to 1 million North Koreans died, but the regime stayed intact. And most recently in 2010, the North Korean government actually carried out a disastrous economic policy. They tried to reform the currency, but in any other country, any other normal economy, that would have led to a regime change, but that didn't happen in North Korea. So I think the only way the regime can change in North Korea is through some sort of civil war. And if that happens, that's the only case where there will be a substantial number of refugees crossing the border. So let's go. The central question here is that we know there could be refugees if there's some sort of contingency in North Korea, but then what we don't know much is the actual size of such an outflow. And I think there are we can go about different ways of analyzing this question, and the central concepts I think is the two concepts here. One is the duration and the coverage of the internal conflict. If with the longer the duration, there will be a stronger intention for the individuals to leave the country. And with the wider coverage, what I mean by the coverage is actually the geographical extent of the of the internal conflict. If the conflict is localized, say in a certain region or a city, then there's no need for people to conduct or engage in a mass movement and leave the country. So we have two dimensions here: coverage and duration. So, I created this simple matrix where, I'm trying to relate these two dimensions to the actual outflow of refugees. And as you can see, that it makes kind of sense that if coverage is high and the duration is long, then, there'll be a lot of people trying to leave the country. But on the other hand, if, there's extensive internal conflict across the country, but it's a short duration, then, people probably want to wait out the conflict and see what happens. The same with the long duration and low coverage, and if it's actually a very quick, quick and limited internal conflict, then people probably stay home. So this is the macro factor to analyze the situation, the potential outflow of refugees in North Korea. And we actually have an actual example of such contingency going on right now in Syria. So I look at the refugee numbers compiled by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and you will see that out of a population of 22 million, 2 million people left the country as of today. And you can see the trend here. And as you can see, when the conflict started, people actually waited and see whether this will actually pass. But as they saw that the duration of the conflict went on and on, they started to leave in droves. So, as you can see that, for the first year of the conflict, people tried to stay home, but after in the second year, people start leaving the country. So I also looked at the historical trends in different civil conflicts. And the first case is the Korean War. It lasted 3 years. And out of 20 million Koreans at the time of the population, 3.2 million people left the country, which shows that in terms of percentage, it's like 16% of the total population. In the case of Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, it only lasted 2 months. It's a very brief conflict. And out of the population of 7 million at the time, 0.75 million left the country, which percentage-wise will be 11%. And for the Rwanda genocide, which is much more serious, and Rwanda is a really small country in terms of geography. 2.1 million people out of 6 million total population of Hutus left the country, and actually it happened really fast. Apparently, up to 250,000 Hutus crossed the border under 24 hours, and that's because the government, the existing government in Rwanda, was complicit in the refugee situation. They wanted to take the Hutu population out of the country and move them to Congo so that they could, maintain this. They keep attacking the Tutsis. And lastly, there's the case of Kosovo War. And out of the population of 2 million people, 350,000 Kosovars left the country, which percentage-wise is 18%. So yes? Sorry. So I'm trying to shade it out the Rwandan case because it's an extreme case where the government didn't collapse. Instead, the government was actually complicit in the refugee crisis. So going back to the case of North Korea, if you look at the historical data, you see that even in a high density, long duration, nationwide civil conflict, the percentage of population who leave the country, the refugees, doesn't really exceed 20%. In the case of larger countries, the percentage is actually lower. So if we assume that 15%, which is a very high percentage, I think, for North Korea, the maximum number of North Korean refugees leaving the country would be 3.6 million. So, but then that's the maximum number, which is theoretical. So if you take into account different factors, the actual number could be actually much lower. And I'm going to show you why. And so this is an individual model of decision making. Essentially, each individual actually engages in some sort of decision making process and tries to weigh the risk and the benefit of becoming a refugee. And it's very simple. So on one hand, you have the risk of staying. You are actually facing imminent violence from some sort of one of the factions. And if you stay long enough, you might starve to death. So but then there's the risk of fleeing, because if you flee your household, then you are exposed to different risks such as violence, accidents, and probably most generally it's a family separation. There's also the fact that once you reach the safe haven, it might not turn out to be the safe haven that you thought. Maybe you might be banned from entering the country, or the host country, I mean, or maybe that even if you pass the border and enter the country, maybe that you don't have the shelter, maybe you don't get any services. So you have all these different risks that you have to balance out. And so the thing is, then the individual will have to make a decision. Then the only factor that they can actually control is actually distance. Because all other risks that you face there, uncertainty at the border, uncertainty in the coast country, and the risks you face during travel, that's actually something that you cannot control. But you can actually control the distance you travel. So what they try to do then will be that minimize the distance to travel to the safe haven. And by minimizing the distance, you are actually controlling the risk you are exposed to. So distance is a very important factor. And the reason why I mentioned this comes later now. And but before going into that, let's briefly explain the situation in North Korea. So North Korea is a peninsula, and in fact, actually, in a way, it's actually isolated because on one side, to the east, you have the sea, to the west, you have the Yellow Sea, and to the south, it's actually blocked by the DMZ. So only channel out of the country, out of the country is actually through the north, to the Chinese border. And the border is actually perfect. It's actually long and porous. And there's also across the border, you have a large ethnic community, so you can actually find shelter there as well. So that's the outlet for them. And in the case of North Korea, you have to look at the population distribution as well, because that will actually help you determine the actual number of refugees. So what you see here is actually a scaled map of the population distribution. So what the resolution you see here is actually a 1 square kilometer. And for each cell of the 1 square kilometer, you have an actual number of population living there estimated from the satellite image data. So the red colors indicate high density areas, the yellow ones indicate like a medium density, and the non-habitable zones are actually where people are not inhabiting. It's actually colored in gray. So, by itself, it's actually interesting looking, but it's not very helpful. So what I try to do is actually determine different zones based on the distance. So what you see here to the north is I try to divide the zone into two major areas first. One, I made this division at just north of Pyongyang, following this major highway that connects Pyongyang to Wonsan. And the reason is because I think Dr. Bennett might know well that 70% of the North Korean military is concentrated, it's located south of Pyongyang, meaning that in the case of an actual conflict, surely the North Korean military will be involved. And if that happens, then the people living in this area might not be able to live or go anywhere because they are actually blocked by the military to the north and DMZ to the south, and they are actually totally blocked off from the rest of the world. So only people, the North Koreans who might be able to leave the country, are living here to the north of Pyongyang. And so then I divided the country into 8 bands, each with 20 to 30 kilometers. And the reason is 20 kilometers is actually the average distance that people can travel by walking. This is pretty much the case in the Joseon dynasty as well. And the reason why I chose walking as a mode of transportation is because in North Korea, the car ownership, private car ownership is really low. It's like actually 2%. So the aspirations of North Koreans is actually having a bicycle. So if you can imagine a contingency scenario, the mode of choice, a mode of transportation of choice for most North Koreans will be walking. Yeah, 20 kilometers per day. And then actually there's, in the case of a geography in Korea, there's a record from the Joseon dynasty that says that the number of days that takes to travel from Busan to Seoul will be like 20 days. So the distance between Seoul and Busan is like around 400 kilometers. So it works out to be 20 to 30 kilometers. And actually also looked up the hiking websites. And then what they say is that, maximum you can aspire to hike every day will be like 20 kilometers. Or 30 kilometers if you're really, really good. So then I labeled each zone by the number of days it takes to reach the border. So if you live just to the north of Pyongyang, it will take you 8 days to reach China. So then I also try to color them, the color according to the number of people living in each zone. So darker the color, more people live there. So in terms of numbers, in the uppermost, the border area, 2.5 million North Koreans live there. In an area that's actually 2 days away by walking from Chinese border, 1.5 million people, 1.5 million North Koreans live there. In 3 days away is 1.8 million, 4 days is 1 million, 5 days will be 2.7 million, and 1.6, 1.9, and 0.6. So if you add them up, it turns out to be like 13 million North Koreans live to the north of Pyongyang, which is around 56% of the total population in North Korea. So in terms of a nice histogram, then you will see that you see that there's a nice break in the middle. So it's like a cycle. It starts with 2.5, goes down to 1, then goes up to 2.7, and goes down to 0.6. So if you model this out, then if you remember in the previous slides, I showed you the percentage of refugees. Percentage of refugees out of our total population, which turned out to be around. I said it will be actually 15%. So if you use that number, multiply that to the baseline population, then if you take into account the geospatial distribution of the population, the baseline population will be much lower than the total population of the country. So instead of 24 million, we have to multiply that 15% with 13 million North Koreans. But the thing is that that's in a normal country. That will be the case in the normal country because in North Korea, people have a very limited access and mobility. So you have to restrict the number even more. So if you add up the population who live within 3 days of travel to the Chinese border, then the total population who are able to live or can consider, actually think about the decision of leaving the country will be actually 5.8 million. So the conclusion is that given the distance to the border, even though it's kind of small, by modern by modern standard, most North Koreans will opt to be an internally displaced person, meaning that instead of leaving the country, they'll probably leave home for a couple of days and move to the countryside with the relatives or so. And then, because of that reason, the refugee situation, even in a serious contingency, shouldn't be that serious in the short run. And that's also the case in the long run. So if you multiply out the previous number, for example, 5.8 million with the 15% percentage, that turns out to be like around 1 million. So that's so far cry from the Syrian case, where like already almost 10% of the population move out of the country. In North Korea, the maximum theoretical will be like around 1 million, which is like around 5%. So that's the conclusion of my research. Thank you. 이거를 앞으로 가는 거고요, 이건 뒤로 가는 겁니다.
Okay, thank you. This is my turn. Well, three presentations are basically talking about the possibility of collapse of North Korean regime, or what would happen after the collapse of North Korean regime. But my research question is, what if North Korean regime survive in the near future? Well, the main theme of this session is long-term scenario of North Korea. Then how long? 100 years? 50 years? We are talking about 50 years later? I believe 50 or 10 or 100 years later, North Korea would not exist on this globe. If they exist, then it should be a totally different DPRK from now. What about in 10 years? I think North Korea is very likely to survive. Why? North Korean leadership will do their best to survive. China has a very strong incentive to support North Korea not to collapse. Japan does not like to see unified, strong Korea. And North Korean people do not want unification. They don't like to be second citizen in a unified Korea. And also economically, North Korean condition is getting better. And since I am an economist, my presentation will focus on the economic condition. I believe North Korean economy has been showing positive growth in recent years. So that means economic condition of North Korea has been improved a lot in recent years. Let me show you economic growth rates of North Korea. Where since the middle of 1950s, DPRK has not published any macroeconomic data. So in South Korea, Bank of Korea, the central bank, is in charge of estimating the Korean economic condition. So this graph is from Bank of Korea. So it's, some years they show negative growth, even though it is positive, it's just a small. However, I believe Bank of Korea underestimated North Korean real economic growth. There are two basic reasons. One is they have method problem. I mean, during the last 10 years in North Korea, so-called market has been expanded a lot, but Bank of Korea cannot capture the size of economic activities in markets in North Korea. So that's why they underestimate the real size of North Korean economy. And the second one is political intention. For instance, 2010, there happened the so-called Jong-un incident. So South Korean government introduced very strong economic sanction against North Korea to punish North Korea. So-called, May 24th measure, 오이사 조치. So if North Korean economy showed positive economic growth, South Korean government is in trouble because even if the government introduced very strong economic sanctions, North Korean economy showed the positive economic growth, then what's for the economic sanctions? So the South Korean government, I believe, has twisted the arms of Bank of Korea to underestimate the real condition. So I think North Korean economic growth rate should be like this. Then why do I believe North Korean economy has been showing a positive economic growth? The first is agricultural production is okay in recent years, according to World Food Program. And also North Korean government budget has been expanding. And also there was very big expansion of market activities. In North Korea, there are more than 300 marketplaces, and also about 90% of North Korean people are involved in market activities. And also the PRK-China trade, the trade volume has been increasing in recent years. And the real size is about, let's say, double because, the data, trade data cannot capture the whole trade between North Korea and China. And major import items are production goods, so it should help North Korean economy to grow. I'm not saying that North Korean economy is okay. They are still, they have still lots of problems. Positive growth, I say, it just means North Korean economy is growing on average. There happened very huge income gap between the regions, Pyongyang and rural areas, and also North Korean classes. And they are still absolutely poor. Comparing to other Asian economies, per capita income of North Korea is the lowest. It's around $500. And also, even though I say North Korean economy has been showing positive growth, the compared to other Asian economies, I think, well, the other economies show, let's say, 10%, 12%, 8%, but I'm not saying that North Korean economic growth rate is far more than 10%. I would say it's around, let's say, 5%. So still, economic growth rate are relatively low. And also food insecurity. According to survey by FAO and WFP, only 7% of North Korean people replied that they are in the condition of food secure. Then what is the reaction of North Korean leadership? Early this year, North Korea introduced so-called simultaneous development of economy and nuclear forces. It's something like, Kim Jong-un doctrine in his era. Many people say that it's just a copy of the old one. His grandfather, Kim Il-sung, introduced, so-called simultaneous promotion of economy and national defense in the early 1960s. So some people say that it's just a copy of the old one. However, I would say it is very, very different because the environment is totally different. In 1960s, North Korean economic condition was okay. They, after the end of Korean War, North Korean economy showed remarkable growth in the 1950s and 60s. So economic condition was okay. However, in the 1960s, the environment has been worse because in 1961 there was military coup in the south, and there was military government in the south, and very many, and also U.S., Japan, so-called U.S., Japan, South Korea try alliance for security. So North Korea felt insecure in their defense, so that's why they started to focus on the defense. However, this time North Korea's new strategy is focusing on the economy. Well, in fact, Kim Jong-un, the new leader of North Korea, has every incentive to improve economic condition. He was appointed by his father as a successor, and maybe elite groups of North Korea approved him as a new leader. However, normal North Korean people do not know him well. From their eyes, Kim Jong-un is just a young man. So he has to show his people that he is able. He's an able leader. So he has to solve economic problems. And also he has to complete building a 강성대국, so-called strong and prosperity country declared by his father. So in his first public speech April last year, Kim Jong-un said that he will improve economic condition to enable his people to live without tightening their belts any longer. And also New Year's address this year, economic growth is the most important task. And also, I have very many examples. Then what about the future? No matter it is a socialist regime or capitalist regime, if you want more outputs, then you need more inputs. Or you should have a better technology. So the future direction of North Korea's economic policy is 100% predictable. Internally, North Korea will and has to introduce measures to improve economic management system to increase economic efficiencies. And also they need more inputs, especially capital. So externally, North Korea should make more special economic zones to attract foreign capital. And such an effort are already started. So-called, July 28th measures last year, North Korea introduced more strong incentives to provide workers to produce more. And also North Korea allowed some, to a certain degree, decentralization of each firm and factory. Also, Mashik skiing ground they are building now, and just some months ago, North Korea introduced new law on economic development zones. So every province of North Korea will make their own special economic zones. Of course, there are certain limits. What is needed is a reform of the system itself, not improvement within the system. And even if North Korea want to attract foreign capital, foreign investors are very likely to stay away from North Korea because of nuclear issues and poor infrastructure. However, this is my last slide. However, North Korean leadership, anyhow, they will adjust to internal and external environment. And as I mentioned earlier, North Korean people does not like unification. They just want to stay in their home. And Chinese interest. China, at the time being, in a near future, China, I believe, will not support Korean unification as a result of the collapse of North Korean regime and North Korean policy of South Korean government. So I think North Korea will survive at least in 10 years. Thank you. Okay, we have now 29 minutes. So in this session, we have 4 presentations, 3 interesting presentations, except mine. So now floor is open. Any questions? Please.
Thank you. Bill Newcomb, United Nations. Dr. Zhou, I noticed next to the last slide, you had an entry saying that United Nations sanctions were preventing investment in the DPRK. United Nations sanctions are not preventing investment in the DPRK. That's a factual matter. They may be influencing investors not to go there because of the DPRK's behavior, but the sanctions measures themselves are not preventing investment, just as a point of fact. But I also have a question for you. I have been on the other side of the Bank of Korea estimates. I've always seen them as overestimating the amount of growth in the DPRK. And the reason is that I think a number of sectors suffer from negative value added. If you look at East Germany, the most advanced, the most industrialized, the most scientifically based, the best organized of all the communist countries, postmortem examinations of East Germany following its unification found that many of the sectors of East Germany were producing negative value added. Given that North Korea is a classic shortage economy, according to Kornai, how in the world can they be not experiencing negative value added?
We will get about 3 or 4 questions, and then we will answer. Some gentleman over there who... Okay.
I would like to thank Dr. Bennett about his paper. At least we now know for sure what is the American dream for Korea look like. At least a dream of some members of American expert community. Barbaric country. Certainly it confirms my conclusion during the previous session that America is not going to have any agreement with barbaric country. I would like to remember the famous saying by former American Vice President that America doesn't negotiate with evil. America defeats it. So I don't think that's and you mentioned Iraq-like experience. I don't think that people in this country would like to have Iraq on the Korean Peninsula. And I, frankly speaking, surprised that RAND Corporation, very authoritative, very well-known organization, instead of producing a detailed roadmap which seeks reconciliation, overcoming difficulties, and looking for compromise between United States and North Korea, produces paper which actually instigate seeds of distrust and conflict between China and North Korea, because of course North Korea wouldn't like if China will be engaged in such theme, how to divide North Korea. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Joe Dongho papers I like the best because very optimistic view on North Korean economy. But I hope that is the case. I'm sure you're an economist. I am political science. That's quite a different view, of course. My question is directed to Dr. Bennett. Your collapse, your report, your book just published. And I haven't finished reading yet, but I'm going to finish it. But I have some problem to understanding your logic, rationale for asserting North Korean collapse. Of course, you mentioned, I like to make a distinction between North Korean government collection, Kim Jong-un regime collection, and DPRK collapse. I think that this should be distinguished. I haven't found in your report any of these differences between the two. I don't know. You consider that North Korean regime collection is the same thing, is the same as the DPRK collapse, and that's my question. I have more questions, but I like to give somebody else to ask question. Scott, you have mentioned the 4 scenario, very interesting. But I wonder, in the next 10 years, what would be the future of 6-party talks, denuclearization, the process? North Korea will continue to assert nuclear status or just give up nuclear weapons? And the scenario could be the war, accidental war, at least a local war. You didn't mention anything about it. That, whether or not there's a possibility of war, maybe possibility of war is very high, but the probability may be very low. That's what do you think about probably 5th scenario? Also, I want to go back again, Bruce. You mentioned something about the quote, reasonable, unquote, probability. I don't understand the meaning. You can clarify that. Thank you.
저 중간에 계신 저 검은 양복 입으신 분. 저 뒤에 분이 아까부터 먼저 손 주셨으니까 좀 먼저 하시죠.
It's very difficult to get a chance to ask him a question. Finally got it. Last session I tried to get it, and since Dr. Cho is an economist, I will ask an economic question with respect to the economic cost of North Korea's nuclear and missile development to DPRK in metric terms, in short, in dollar terms, to say, based on their current pace of development program, say this year or next year, let's suppose they test fire 2 missiles a year or 1 nuclear test a year. Let's just suppose that for the time being, and what the cost will be, or anybody's studying about those costs. I had an opportunity to discuss with my old good friends from the State Department during the break, and we discussed this topic, and we didn't have any answer. Perhaps you do, or the rest of the audience can look into this, and especially economists and those who are interested in the possibility of a North Korean collapse would certainly look into what's the bearing of this economic cost because of their nuclear and the Missile Development Program, which is everybody agrees and can say that it's got to be cost would be enormous. But if we know better metric terms, then we can probably be able to better the prospect of failure or success of what they call a dual parallel promotion of economic and nuclear programs as espoused by Kim Jong-un. That's one question. I do like to make one distinction. Dr. Kwak had a trouble understanding DPRK, whether it's the country's collapse or the regime's collapse, but I have a different distinction that I like to make. That is, I do share public abhorrence of the horrible nature of the North Korean regime, no doubt about it. I share the wish that, which we call pretty often wishful thinking, that North Korean regime goes away as it is. But at the same time, that's one part of the equation. The other side is a real possibility of a collapse, I should say possibility of collapsibility. And I think you mentioned in some of the places that it would maybe short-term possibility, say for the next year, it would be only 2%, but we got to be insured. That's fine, but you have life insurance, like you insure your own home house from against the fire. That's fine. Or life insurance, for example, that's fine. But life insurance policy often you do have something. You get something back. If you know if some of the premiums or part of it at least, or interest, whatever, and we gotta have some kind of incentives to pay that policy premiums. Of course, I have all kinds of questions with respect to your judgment about what might happen. That North Korean regime would collapse. Bill Parrish tried to figure that out very hard, and his conclusion was it's not going to collapse, so therefore there was an alternative. We have to deal with the North Koreans, and not as we wish it to be, but as it is. Although we don't like it, we had to do that. I don't think that the kind of thinking hasn't changed yet, but that's one area. Now, I like some of the ideas Scott explained here. That is, first two paradigms. One is, say, de facto perpetuation, not perpetuation, but at least to continue the state of status quo, coexistence. But if that process leads to your second paradigm, that would be eventual unification. I think that's pretty good. And in fact, that's the whole idea of Kim Dae-jung government's sunshine policy. First, we're going to have the confederation of the two states, and moving and developing into full-scale unification. And Im Dong-un described that as first stage would be de facto unification, where exchanges are freely taking place. There will be no tension. They will maintain it and help economically each other. Eventually, de jure unification, and that's by legal unification, where Korea will become a unified country. But I do not agree with your third option, that is unification by violence. I think in theory that might be the shortest way, subject to Chinese agreement or just acquiescence at least. China has to let this thing happen without intervening. But that will be shortest way. But my problem with that kind of a scenario is, I don't think who's going to win. I mean, that's the matter. It doesn't matter. Certainly, South Korea and allies would win. Let me give you just one more minute, because I'm about to conclude, okay? That is, I don't think South Koreans are ready to take up the damage, to absorb the damage that will inflicted upon
thank you, sir.
Korean people.
We got the point, because we have more
That's
questions.
the point.
So
I'm just making the point right now. That's a very important point. So you're not going to interfere with me
5
now.
seconds. Okay.
5 seconds. Okay, so that's, I have to be rude because to make my point, because that's the way precisely always moderators always do their way. And we sit through here listening to them very carefully and attentively. Even some of them things don't make any sense. But nevertheless, the question is, so what would be your response to that? One more question for Dr. Go. All right, good enough. Good enough.
예. 진짜 앞에 분 we will collect two more questions, and then we will.
Thank you very much. My
Okay.
name is Han-Gwon Kim. I'm a research fellow in
Please be
Asan
short,
Institute.
please.
Yes, I have two questions. One is I definitely agree with Dr. Jo Dongho's points, perspective. That just one question. When we, according to the Iran case, the sanctioned country also showed a natural economic fluctuation. When you show the perspective, how do you so sure it's not a natural fluctuation of North Korean economy, just going upward, not the overall environmental changes?
We will have last 1 to 3. Please speak in 1 minute. Okay.
Real simple question for Bruce Bennett. You present a predicament without a solution. What would make you comfortable in terms of defense spending or the size of ROK defense that would give you a good night's rest?
Thank you. Jae-bum Kim from Korean American Association. Let me get you the shortest question to Professor Jo. I need some explanation between your long-term projection and short-term of 10 years and 50 years. Maybe in between there is a watershed. What kind of factors do you imagine to get the 10 years muddle through versus 50 years collapse? Thank you.
예, 좀 마지막 last question.
Thank you. Two quick questions to Professor Jo and Dr. Go. Professor Jo, you give us a prospect of the North Korean economy in 10 years. My question is, let's suppose all external variables remain unchanged. Sanction regime will be there, and the current policy of DPRK will continue. And what is your opinion or projects about the 2 to 3 years economic trends of DPRK? Now they are in the recovery. They are on the recovery track. So in 2 to 3 years, they will continue the recovery, go to the prosperity, or some fluctuation. And Dr. Go, you mentioned the refugee problem. Recently ago, a news story from Pyongyang was the new leader Kim Jong-un gave a big award to a returner who escaped from the north to the south. Do you think it is a single case or indicator for some kind of new policies toward such a people in North Korea? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with.
Well, I appreciate the wealth of questions. As I look at the potential for collapse, I think I recognize both in my book and what I showed on my chart the difference between regime and government collapse. I think both are possible. In terms of what I wrote in the book, I said that the topic of the book was about government collapse and not regime collapse, and so I wasn't going to develop the regime collapse case in any detail. I think I can show you what page that's on if there's a question. In terms of the probabilities, the reasonable probability and so forth of a collapse, what I wrote in the book was not intended to deal with all of the futures of North Korea. It was intended to deal with collapse. That was the topic of the book. There are many other alternatives, as I showed on the chart today. But if there is a collapse, it seems to me that A, we're probably not going to be able to predict it. B, we're probably not going to be able to stop it. It will happen. In fact, if we influence it, it'll probably be to accelerate it. And C, it seems to me it will be very expensive to deal with, very difficult, very challenging, and so forth. That's why I draw the analogy to life insurance, or fire insurance is actually what I've used in the past. I don't think the probability of my house burning down is very high this year. You know, it's what, 0.0001% or some such thing. And so that doesn't mean, though, that because it's a low probability that I ignore it. I take actions to prevent flammable things from being in my house, to avert the possibility, and I buy insurance to cover it just in case something does happen. I think we have to, in overall policy planning, look how you deal with that possibility in exchange for how we deal with all the other cases. But if your focus is just on collapse, I think there are many things we need to do. I didn't talk today about how we would potentially deal with the problems, especially the military challenges. The South Korean military is going to get smaller. There really isn't much choice in that unless President Park Geun-hye decides to go back to a 36-month conscription period or something like that. And I think the political prospects of that are very close to zero. And so I think it means that South Korea needs to be looking much more seriously at reserve force policies. For 60 years, the South Korean military reserves have largely been individual reservists who would be called in to fill attrition and help defend in front of Seoul. Training them a few days a year would allow them to be able to fire their rifle and do the mission that they needed to do. Going offensively into North Korea, going in where you have to try to deal with insurgency and very complicated conditions, requires more training, requires more expenditure, requires more preparation, and probably requires some degree of integration of those reserves into the active duty. But I'll stop there and say I've got a whole set of discussions on that in the book. Thanks.
Okay, Scott, would you answer in 3 minutes?
Sure. I really just want to make 3 points. One is I was asked about the future for six-party talks. And actually the way I like to frame this is not so much focused on talks or actual negotiations, but the idea of a six-party framework. And I believe that the framework is likely to endure because I think that there is a consensus among all the parties, with the exception of North Korea that has walked away from it, in favor of denuclearization of North Korea. And so I think that we cannot abandon the six-party process because it is the place where North Korea has actually signed up to the abandonment of nuclear weapons and then subsequently has reneged on that. That's the reason why we don't have talks. But for that reason, I actually think that the framework is going to last because I don't see any of the neighbors stepping away from a priority on denuclearization. That leads to my second point, which is really about, actually I did talk about war because I was talking about peaceful processes versus violent processes, and I think that war is violent. And what I'm really concerned about at this stage is that because of the intransigence over the nuclear issue, the probability of a peaceful process is declining. The desirability of a peaceful process is still very high, but the probability is declining. And then I'll just conclude with one other variable that I probably should have included in this presentation, but I didn't, that I think is significant, and that is the issue of pace, which is also part of means. And clearly there are preferences and ways in which whether or not this pace of change is gradual or sudden will have an impact on the outcome. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess I have the briefest answer. Yeah, regarding to the question of Professor Yang's question on whether the recent news of the North Korean defectors going back to North Korea is isolated or generalized phenomena. My answer, very simple answer, is that I think it's actually pretty frequent. I think it actually corroborates what Professor Joe said. The situation in North Korea has improved economically, So that's what happens in many cases, in not just in North Korea, but in other underdeveloped economies. People go back to their homes. So I think no, surely the North Korean regime tried to make a big news out of it, but I think it's actually pretty prevalent. Thanks.
Okay, let me briefly answer to the questions to me. Where basically what I want you to say is that North Korean leadership will try to do their best to survive and to keep their power as strong as possible. Well, so I believe North Korean government will introduce more and more strong incentive schemes and some better economic management systems in the near future. And I believe it will have some positive effects on the economic condition of North Korea. Well, a gentleman talked about the difference between the case of former East Germany, where that's right. North Korean economy is much worse than the former East Germany. However, North Korean economy is very small, so even a small amount of investment would help North Korean economy greatly. So external capital and internal effort to improve economic management system will help North Korean economy to grow. And meanwhile, there should be some economic fluctuations, of course. I'm not saying that North Korean economy will go straight to the positive directions. However, all this effort would not be enough because the problem of North Korean economy is the system itself, socialist regime, planned economic regime, and also 주체, self-reliance regime. So North Korean economic problem is from this system itself. Such an incentive system where some changes in economic management system will not basically help North Korean economy. So that's why I said for coming some years, let's say 5 years, 10 years, North Korean economic condition will be better. However, at some point of time, let's say 10 years later, North Korean leadership will face the fatal choices to really change, wide opening and reform the system itself, or just stay that change it. If North Korea chooses the second option, North Korea will go to the direction of collapse. However, if North Korea decides to change, then South Korea and international society will help North Korea. So maybe we will see some different, better DPRK as our neighbor. Well, let me stop here, and we are almost the end of this session. So let me declare the session is over. Thank you.
So this concludes the last session of the Asan North Korea Conference. To give the closing remarks, it is my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Dr. Go Myong-hyun, the lead organizer for the conference.
Yeah, my name is Go Myong-hyun. I wasn't just a speaker here. Actually, I organized a conference, not just for the first time, but for the second time. I organized the first North Korea conference 2 years ago, and then I have the pleasure of organizing the second conference this year. And it's really, it's actually almost brings tears of joy to my eyes to see so many people here, and there's so many participants from around the world, and also as the press. We got so many mentions the last couple of days. And then I think this really marks an occasion where we are moving beyond just discussing policy. We are trying to influence policy when it comes to North Korea. I think South Korea, which is the most important interest, has the most interest in the North Korean policy, didn't have much of the voice. The world didn't hear us that much. I think that should change. I think, and then we'll try to be, the promoter of that change. And I'd like to thank the staff First of all, they work so much. Dr. Ham says several times that, even though everything was smoothly here, we are like a swan. Swan looks very elegant outside, but on the water, we are moving furiously. And so we have Ross, we have my program officer, Sung Ji. She's not here because she's doing something else right now for the speakers. And we have, officers from the program officers from the external affairs. I appreciate their, contribution here so much. And of course, the speakers and moderator who did a great job. And, and we learned so much in the last 2 days. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming. Thank you.